All right. Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started now. If you want to say hi and introduce yourself in the chat, please feel free to go ahead and do that. We're going to get started on the webinar today. My name is Laura Casarigola. I'm a school gardens coordinator at Grow NYC. And today I'm joined by Chloe and Eve, who also work for Grow NYC at our teaching garden on Governor's Island. And so we're going to go over today how to grow cold weather crops using the season extenders like high tunnels and low tunnels. For today's workshop, please feel free to put all of your questions into the Q&A, which is the function in the toolbar. That'll help us keep track of the questions so we can answer them at the end. Feel free to talk to us through the chat. And we are recording this workshop, and we'll send you the recording in a follow-up email along with any other materials we go through today. You can find more materials on our distance learning site, which is grownycdistancelearning.org. So we're Grow NYC. We're a nonprofit that works to protect the environment, create green spaces, help people stay healthy, and give them the opportunity to make a positive impact. We work in areas of conservation, green space, education, food access, and agriculture in all 5 boroughs of New York City. So I'm going to turn it over to Eve and Chloe to start the workshop on cold weather crops.
Thanks, Laura. Again, my name is Chloe. I am the farm coordinator at Grow NYC's teaching garden on Governor's Island. We are a 1-acre fruit and vegetable farm. In non-COVID times, we run field trips for about 5,000 New York City school children, as well as some older adults. But this year, when schools were not in session, we shifted and did a little more production and donated a lot of produce and flowers to different organizations throughout the city. So we also actually this year experimented a little more with some season extension. We'll talk about that today. So we're going to start out really simple. Just I think it makes the most sense to have like a simple background here and talk about our growing seasons and what causes them and what our seasons are without any kind of season extension. So we'll start by why we have seasons. It's something we don't really think about too often, right? But the seasons are caused by the tilt of the Earth's rotational axis away from or towards the sun as it travels through its year-long path around the sun. So what that means for us is longer days in the summer, and therefore hotter days in the summer because we have the sun on the ground for longer, and shorter and colder days in the winter like we're experiencing now. And the further we are from the equator, the more extreme our seasonal shifts are. And we're pretty far north. I think Laura said there's at least somebody from Toronto, so some people who have a little further north, right? So we're dealing with shorter growing seasons than somebody who would be closer to the equator. And for the teaching garden and for New York City, we're in USDA zone 7B. And what that defines is our planting dates. So our first frost and our last frost. And of course, these are averages, and of course, they are changing with the climate. But as of right now, we usually begin planting in like late April, sometimes a little bit earlier if it's looking really warm and it looks like it's going to stay warm. And we usually finish gardening late October, sometimes like first week of November. And these are the dates without any kind of like assistance, any kind of methods like we're going to talk about today. So for school gardeners, unfortunately, most of the school year lands in between, right, outside of the growing season. So these tips might be good for people who are having school gardens. So what we're going to focus on mostly is crop protection. And there's 2 main forms, high tunnels and low tunnels. As you can see from the pictures, they kind of look the same, just very different scales. And basically, they're both an added layer of protection from the weather. So they're going to trap a little bit of heat. In the case of a high tunnel, which is plastic, it's going to actually it's actually going to draw in the sun there, and it's going to hold in moisture as well. So this allows you to plant earlier in the spring and also later in the fall than planting without tunnels. So even the next slide, Laura. Thank you. So along with your tunnels, like the tunnels don't allow you to just plant anything you want whenever you want to. We also need to make sure we're choosing plants that are correct for the time of year, and also growing within the tunnel. So there's plants that tolerate cold weather. There's plants that actually thrive in cold weather. A lot of plants get sweeter, and that's because they actually transform starches into sugar so they don't freeze completely. And these plants include brassicas, so like your kale, collards, cabbages, Brussels sprouts, those things you may notice get sweeter in the winter. Leeks and onions do really well. Also, a lot of root vegetables grow really well like this. So carrots, parsnips, turnips, anything like that. Eve's going to talk a little more later about what to plant when, so don't worry about that. This is just a little overview. The other thing to consider is scheduling. So you need to be organized. For the teaching garden, we have like a multi-page document crop plan that's going to tell us what we want to plant when to start the seeds if we're going to transplant them. And this is something we refer to and sometimes change throughout the season. And what's most important for season extension, especially from the fall into the winter, is you want to make sure you start your seeds on time. For most plants in our zone or colder, you're going to plant their seeds by maybe early September at the latest. They have to start to sprout and be strong enough before the frost hits, even if you're going to cover them. One of the things that can help you make your schedule on your seed packets is usually a days to maturity number. And you can just count backwards from that. So for zone 7B, I believe our first frost technically is November 14th. And what you would do is count backwards. If that's the day that you want your plant to be mature, you would take your days to maturity and count backwards to find the last possible date that you could plant those seeds. I know that School Gardens has some great planting calendars, and I'm sure Laura would be happy to share those with you as well.
Yeah, we have some crop calendars for spring planting and fall planting. It's not quite as technical as this one that I see here with like the germination rate and all of that. It's a little more simplified, and it has a list of maybe like 30 most common plants that people grow, and it has their days to maturity already on there for like the most common varieties. So I'll make sure to share that out too.
All right, so let's jump into high tunnels. This is the first one that we're going to talk about today. High tunnels are permanent structures or semi-permanent structures that can be used all season long. We'll talk about many of their uses in a couple slides. But basically what they're doing is trapping the heat, and they are doing this by just being covered in this thick, clear plastic. And the advantages of a high tunnel, first of all, the fact that they are permanent structures, it's a lot less labor intensive throughout the season. Second of all, they're big enough to stand up in. So this is for somebody who has a lot of space. The one in the picture is pretty large. They can be, 6 feet by 10 feet, 6 feet by 8 feet, probably not much smaller than that. But they're great. They're unheated, usually. You can heat them. You can also install things like fans to regulate them more. At the teaching garden, we have a regular unheated one, and it tends to run about 20 degrees warmer than outside air temperatures without doing anything else to it. So if you are interested in constructing a high tunnel for your garden space, there are a lot of different kits that you can buy online. Some of them snap together. Some of them you have to bend the hoops like the picture you see here. Bending the hoops, it's just a piece of wood with some like nails or something shaped in the right angle. And basically you like slowly pull the hoop around. It is hard to do. It usually requires at least 2 people. Um,
It
but
kind
it
of
is
looks like it
doable.
could have a slingshot effect. Is that accurate?
No, it's the opposite. It's very, very, very hard to pull it.
Okay.
But it, you definitely you want to know what you're doing. They do luckily sell kits that have everything that you need if this is the route that you want to go. Um, you want to be sure that you're working with like a level ground, um, and that you have at least one other person to help you. A lot of the tasks require 2 people. Um, so basically, you bend these metal hoops, and they connect together to make a frame, and then you cover it with this plastic. And what you do on a warm day is just stretch it really tight. And there's something called a wiggle wire that holds it into place. Um, so relatively straightforward. It is a little labor intensive, takes up some space, and it also requires a decent amount of resources. These kits are usually a few $1,000s. There are also ways, if you look around online, to make it yourself without a kit, which requires a little more on the skill set end and less on the resources end. So if that's something that sounds interesting to you, it is possible to make them for less money, but you would need a little more in the construction skill set. So let's talk a little bit about how we use high tunnels. Like I said, one of the benefits of a high tunnel is that it's permanent or semi-permanent. So you can use it throughout the season. Early in the spring at the teaching garden, we sometimes start seeds in the high tunnel. This is, an alternative to starting seeds indoors. It's a lot easier for us because then we don't have to transport them later out to the garden. So we'll start the seeds indoors in the high tunnel. And when they're ready, when they start to come up and they're big enough, we can just bring them in and out to harden them off and get them ready for planting. The benefits of starting in the high tunnel, obviously it's a little bit warmer. It's also humid, which is great for the seedlings. And it's protected from the wind and the rain. So even the smallest seedlings will do okay in there. We also sometimes have grown in containers in our high tunnel. One year we grew ginger and turmeric in milk crates in our high tunnel. And they did really well. It's basically like a more tropical environment in there. Other gardens grow in ground, so they'll have raised beds or just straight in the ground in their high tunnel. And what you can do is, like the picture here, you can start early in the spring and grow things like lettuce, or the same late in the fall. Or in the middle of the summer, you can grow your heat-loving crops like peppers and tomatoes and sweet potatoes in there as well. So Eve is going to talk a little bit about low tunnels.
Yes. So hello, everyone. My name is Eve, and I'm the education coordinator in the teaching garden. So low tunnels, we can hit the next slide, are similar to high tunnels, but kind of a miniature version. So they're usually anywhere from 2 to 4 feet tall, and they can be anywhere from 2 to 6 feet wide, but you can actually fit them to fit on any bed. So whether it's really long or a little bit shorter and wider, a low tunnel will work for you. They're made with a frame and a fabric. So the frame can either be like a plastic or metal pipe or PVC pipe, or it can be a wire. And you bend them into hoops and then basically cover them with some type of fabric, which we'll get more into that later. So how they work, it's similar to how a high tunnel works. It's kind of like a little microclimate inside of the tunnel that is intended to be warmer than outside the tunnel. High tunnels work a little better than low tunnels do if you're going for like a really high heat, but low tunnels can be great too. And they protect plants from wind, snow, they can protect plants from pests, and they're a little bit cheaper and easier to implement than high tunnels. But again, they are temporary, so they're only going to be there for part of the season. They can also conserve water, especially if you use like a plastic. The condensation can collect on the inside of the high tunnel, and then it will fall back into the soil rather than being evaporated. So let's get into more on the types of row cover. So depending on what your reasoning is for wanting a low tunnel, there are many different types of row cover fabric you can use. Usually they are thin, as you can see in this top left picture. You can kind of see that person's hand through it. And it's thin enough to let through air, light, rain, but they can also be thicker. So depending on your climate, if you're hoping to get something that's a little more heat protected, you can see in the next picture on the top right, the leftmost fabric is much thicker than the rightmost fabric. So if you're doing something like pest control with this, you would use like a thinner, lighter fabric, but that has a much finer mesh so that, I mean, most of them, bugs aren't going to get through, but in the teaching garden, we often reuse our row cover. So sometimes there'll be little holes, but it still works. And you can also use plastic as a low tunnel. This is something that's a little more labor intensive, like you'll need to come check on it more. You'll have to have more access to the garden, or you can use it. We have plastic kind of low tunnels all over our flower garden right now because we're trying to solarize the beds. So we're just hoping to kill off all of the weeds by kind of trapping the plants in there without any water. If it's really cold, you can also cover your plants with bed sheets or drop cloths, but you'll need to remove those during the day. That's kind of like an overnight thing. And yeah, I think that's that for that slide. So the next we can go into the construction. So basically you set up the framing first. So whether that's plastic or metal pipes or wire hoops or wire things, you're gonna bend them and place them at the beginning of the bed and the end of the bed, and then about every 1 to 2 feet. And then you will lay the row cover over top. So you'll make sure to pull it tight and tuck it in on the side so that there's not a bunch of loose fabric. So we sometimes braid our fabric at the end, especially if we're using a longer piece than the bed is long. And then you can secure it with staples is what we use, which are these like little U-shaped, I don't even know what they are, like wire things. You can also just use rocks or sandbags or really anything you have lying around. The next slide, you'll see some photos of people doing it. So that guy is using a PVC pipe on like a small square bed. The next one are little wire hoops. And then it's possible to put up low tunnels by yourself. It's a little easier with somebody else, but we've both done it on our own, I believe. And you can see this one is secured with sandbags. And yeah, that's it for that. So this allows you to do some winter growing. So there are 3 main types of winter growing we're going to talk about here. There's overwintering, which is where you can have your plants survive over the whole winter, harvest from them over the whole winter. There's winter sowing or spring sowing, where you can plant seeds into the ground earlier in the year than you would without a low tunnel. And then there's season extension. So using low tunnels to grow further into the winter, like into December, rather than stopping in November. So let's start with starting earlier in spring. So with low tunnels, you can start crops about 2 to 3 weeks earlier, and you want to plant when the soil is about 40 degrees. So you can use a little thermometer to check. The next slide, we have protecting against frost. So you can see in the picture on the left, they trenched the soil. So lower in the ground is going to be a little warmer, and it also provides a little bit of wind protection for those little plants. So that's not actually something we've done in the teaching garden. We usually don't do a lot of winter growing, but that is something you can do. And you can also make a DIY cloche, which is there in that picture on the right. They're using the top half of a 2-liter soda bottle, and that would be just for like one little plant. Would help keep it a little warmer in there. So what and when to plant fall? So this is if you're using a low tunnel to extend your season in the fall. You can plant transplants in mid-August to early September. And again, it's going to be warm around that time, but we're, like Chloe was talking about with days to maturity, we want our plants to be big enough that come November and December, they're not going to die off if there's like a big snow. So bok choy does well in the fall, broccoli, cabbage, most brassicas, cauliflower, collards, kale. You can also direct seed in the fall to overwinter or to extend your season. Some things that do well are carrots, lettuce, kohlrabi, radish, turnip, spinach, beets, and legumes like peas or beans. So next we can move on to spring. Again, you're going to want to plant when the soil is around 40 degrees in March. And some of the things that do well in this a little bit colder or would do well in the low tunnel are onions, scallions, and then again, some brassicas, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, collards, kale, and chard, and bok choy. And then you can also direct seed around that time of year, leeks, lettuce, kohlrabi, radish, turnip, spinach, beets, and peas again. So it's all similar. You'll notice the vegetables that you would plant late in the fall are similar to the ones that you would plant early in the spring because it's around the same temperature on both of those sides of the season. So yeah, that's pretty much what we have to talk about. And I think now we can open it up to questions.
Awesome.
So,
cool. So we have a couple of questions in here now, but if new questions occur to you, put them in the Q&A and we can hang around for a while and answer any questions you might have. So first one is, can you use low tunnels inside of high tunnels for certain plants?
I like that question. I have heard of using low tunnels inside high tunnels because low tunnels can also be used for pest management. Like Eve was saying, not sure. I imagine it would add a little more heat, but I'm not sure how, like, I don't think it would actually like double the heat aspect that you're getting. But it's definitely possible. You should definitely keep an eye on moisture if you are doing that, because remember that inside your high tunnel, you're not getting any rain or anything like that. And if it's going to be extra hot in there, it's going to dry out even faster. But definitely possible. I'd love to hear if you try it, if it's any warmer in there.
Yeah, I feel like that would be a good experiment to set up and plant the same things inside the mini low tunnel and high tunnel and see if there's any difference. Someone asked if they could get a copy of the PowerPoint to reread later, and that's fine with me. I can post that. What I'm going to do is post the recording of this workshop and all the materials on our distance learning site, so I'll put all of that in the same space. Someone asked, is it realistic to try to set something like this up on a roof?
Yeah, I mean, if you're growing on a roof, then it's prepared for a certain amount of weight. I think that in New York City, we have, places like the Brooklyn Grange that have large greenhouses. I would make sure if you're talking about a private building that your roof can handle the weight, because we're talking about adding a lot of infrastructure up there. Mostly the
Yeah.
soil inside, if you're going to have like raised beds, is very heavy.
Yeah, I think low tunnels would probably be a bit easier to secure as well. If you're building a high tunnel on a roof, I don't know if you'd have to like make sure to weigh that down so that it can't like blow away. I don't know if that's ever a concern with high tunnels.
I don't have any roof experience, but I can't think of any other concerns other than the weight. Yeah, I guess the wind. For our low tunnels, actually, we use those metal pieces that Eve showed you, and those actually go like almost a foot into the ground on either side of our bed. So you like to secure them. So you might need to think of another creative way to secure them, like to put them into, cement or something like that, so that they keep their shape if you don't have a lot of soil, like if you're on a roof. It's not as deep.
All right. Someone asked, for mid-August planting, what must be ripening time for cabbage? It grows slower than in May, and the transplant will still need 50 to 60 days. I'm not sure I understand that question totally.
Are they maybe getting at like the plants grow slower when it gets colder out?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, they do need a little bit of extra time. At the teaching garden, we found it doesn't usually take that much longer for cabbage in particular. We tend to grow more like Napa cabbage and things like that in the fall. They have a slightly shorter days to maturity. And our mid-August planting is usually ready by like October. So maybe it's, towards the longer end of the days to maturity, but we find that it doesn't, it's not in the ground long enough for the days to be like that much shorter for it. That's definitely an issue when you're growing like into the winter. It's like the growing slows down a lot.
So going back to the question about like a rooftop high tunnel or low tunnel, did they need to have a bed of soil as well? I imagine they would if they were doing a low tunnel situation, but I think for a high tunnel, you wouldn't necessarily have to have a bed of soil, right?
Yeah, we actually don't have beds in our high tunnel at the teaching garden. We have tables for starting seeds, and we have, sometimes we put in containers and grow in containers. So a high tunnel doesn't have to have beds in it.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on cold frames and where do they fall on the high or low tunnel spectrum? Do they provide more or less like growing assistance or season extension?
I don't really know how to compare them. Cold frames are great. They're pretty easy to build. If people are not familiar, cold frame is usually just like a piece of like plexiglass or something like that, angled towards the sun on top of a raised bed. And you can grow throughout the winter in there too. They trap heat really well. They also trap moisture, so you don't have to worry about watering your plants. So that's great if you're like a school gardener and you'll be away on the weekends or something like that. I imagine that they hold more heat than a low tunnel, just because the materials they're made out of. They're going to get a lot less wind in there and things like that. But I'm not sure. Laura, do you know which is?
I wouldn't know in terms of a comparison, but we do have some, I think we have some like really simple carpentry plans for how you could build a cold frame where you like attach the piece of plexiglass onto the garden bed, and then you can like keep opening it up or angling it a little differently as your plants grow. So I can attach that onto our post as well with this recording and other materials. But cold frames, I feel like it also would depend on how big your bed is. Because if it's just like a really small square foot bed and you put a piece of plexiglass on top, that could probably stay pretty hot. And also probably depends on, sometimes people are just growing in like those plastic tubs and they'll put glass or plastic on top of it to make it a frame. So that would probably get colder than if you're using a wooden bed. So I think it kind of depends what materials you're using, how big it is. but cold frames are awesome and like probably super cheap as well, because you can just find an old piece of plexiglass or some plastic, poke some holes in it, and that's basically a cold frame. All right, I think that's all the questions that we have right now. If anyone has any last minute burning questions, or if I missed it, just put it in the Q&A really quick before we log off today. But I think that's all of them. So we'll make sure to send you out these materials. We'll send you the recording, stuff on cold frames, crop calendars, and some other resources. You'll be able to find it on GrowNYC, distancelearning.org, but we'll also send you an email if you were signed up for this. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And we will see you at our next workshop. We have one in 2 weeks on February 23rd. So check out our Eventbrite, same place where you signed up for this one. And we'd love to see you at our next workshop. Bye, everyone.